Fairy Tail, Person of Mystery. Bet you thought I was going to do Mystican. Wrong. I'm doing Hades. This was a character, funny enough, actually foreshadowed pretty early on, like after we found out about Jalal's whole situation of being, manipulated by Ultir. We find out when she's talking to Hades that she killed. She's not, because she was set up as one of the council. Funny enough, she was the first character in the series to actually exist. It's actually Ultir, funny enough. But from that, she was a member of the council during the events of that arc, the very end of the Tower of Heaven. We find out she's actually a member of Grimoire Heart, which at the time of was the strongest Dark Guild, though I feel like because probably Tartarus wasn't as even close to as active, much more hush hush. But Hades, Hades was shown two times prior to actually showing up as being like more teased. We only found out a little bit about him during that first station with him and Ultir, and it was just pretty much his voice. And then we found right before the start of the Oracion Stace arc, we got just a little bit of a shadow of him, which is I always thought was really funny because if you go look and back at that part, he's way bigger in that silhouette. I think it's chapter 131. Go back and look at there, like sitting down, and his like legs up into like his knees are like they take up about half of Ultir's body. So given that first part, he was probably like 12 feet tall or something ridiculous. Then he's still pretty tall, like still like probably like mid 6 foot, probably like 3, 6, 4. You actually see him next to a lot of the characters, like in the Natsu. He's a big dude, but he himself was a very mysterious character leading up to it. You didn't know anything about him, and then when you finally find out about him, throughout the series, you know that Makarov was the first guild master of, or sorry, third guild master of Fairy Tail. We get like name drops of Mavis being the founder, and then we find out who was Preach Galebolg, that being the second guild master, the one that left it on to Makarov. And he has a lot of things that I think are really interesting that kind of like are a lot smaller in the series, a lot more kind of like tied down in things you only notice if you compare them, not his overall character. Like for instance, back when he was a treasure hunter before he knew magic, his thing was he danced with blades, which is really interesting because a lot of the characters in Fairy Tail, there's way more kind of like traditional caster mages versus combat mages, but in he of all of them made the most sense because before he was a wizard, he was a treasure hunter. He trained himself very physically, as we saw in Fairy Tail Zero. He was actually very proficient at martial arts, like fighter, both in just like straight hand-to-hand combat, but also his chain blades that he used was just an expert in those. That being why he had like chain magic when we see him, which is also a little nod to Hades. Hades, his weapons being chains of the underworld and whatnot. But not only that, actually, something that I think is, I'm wondering if this was intentional by Mishima. I would like to believe so. Is that we know that August actually remember everything since birth because of how high of a level of magic he had. But he talked about how essentially light and darkness didn't dictate something like love in the idea, whereas Hades saw that as like light and darkness, good and evil wasn't really an aspect of the overall world. Those were very much like perspectives and concept, which is I feel like would make sense if August got that from Hades because he would remember things about him during the the moments that the brief moments that he was with him. We don't know what day he decided to ditch little newborn August somewhere in the woods. Very sad, but Hades was he wasn't the nicest guy in a lot of ways. He still cared actually a lot about like the people in this guild. He actually treated them pretty well. Like if you go back and look at even the part where he's talking to Ultir back when she was looking in time magic and she learned about lost ages, he was telling her that she was not allowed to use it because the consequence following up with it. Wasn't like a straight bad guy, but Hades is I think one of the perfect examples when people try and like talk about Fairy Tail being a lot more lighthearted because I've always really liked that Fairy Tail has a lot of like lighthearted vibes, and then when it gets into a dark thing, it's like goes heavy into the dark thing because Hades was literally just Magic Hitler. He wanted to create the great world of magic to where non-magic folk wouldn't be able to survive, and just like kill them off because he's more worthy. And that's 90% of the people right to a world that can't use magic. He was perfectly fine committing genocide, like discriminatory genocide against 90% of the world, to lead up to pretty much a paradise, a world where only strong of magic could survive, because he saw that as magic pretty much being the thing that dictates whether or not you are important and what. And then, taking in very powerful people into Grimoire Heart, giving them lost magic being very specific in its level of influence, because we know like they pretty much got forgotten about intentionally, broken they were. And I'm very curious of like why he didn't learn the Arc of Embodiment. I think it's like it official is Arc of Inc, the one that Rusty Rose had. I did do a video on Rusty Rose. There's so much to talk, just kind of like look at his character. But with that, he had a lot about like even the previous aspect of the character, and I think he's funny enough one of the characters that I think deserves like a spin-off more than others, because just that long journey of him going from a member of the Fairy Tale Guild, being a pretty good person, and then just slowly walking down this like pathway into the abyss of magic, the depths of magic, wanting to find the great world of magic, as he saw with Zareth, and like well, perfectly fine with committing genocide to 90% of the population in the process. Because he was actually trained by Zareth. That's one of the really interesting things about Fairy Tail Zero, is we find out, there's always a thing like when founder characters, are much more powerful. Someone like Madara and Hachirama, whatnot. They always have this kind of like super OG presence, and obviously the members that founded Fairy Tail were all pretty powerful. Yuri was the only one we never got really much of a scope on, because like obviously we saw how powerful Hades was. Mavis was still really powerful, but like she was also very like heavily set on intelligence and strategy. Whereas Warren was like a really high level support mage. One thing that's very looked down upon him is like he was able to create a tree that traveled 1,000 kilometers over like such a short span of time that they were surprised not to. Pretty crazy stuff. But Hades just seemed like a step above, because he was also like this pretty much big raid boss character. There were a lot of complexities to him, because to him, he wasn't doing anything bad. He was following in what he thought was the betterment of the world of magic. People saw the depth of magic. He thought it was where everything kind of stemmed from. He actually talks about how originally people who were magic were very discriminated against, very much like they were persecuted. Similar to something like you look at like the idea of like the trials, like the witch trials, whereas the idea of like magic people was like black magic, like pretty much like and whatnot. I don't know the whole depth story of them, but you know what I mean. They saw magic people as bad, and then eventually throughout time, magic kind of became like part of the culture, and it seemed much more relaxed. Like it's interesting to think about in that idea, because it's like you see Fairy Tale World, and magic is just a staple of everything. It can be as intense or as harmless as like we've seen like some of the crazier magics. Look at anything like Ethereon, a cross time space like dimensional magic that pretty much like erases things from versus like okay, you have like magic that it's like all it does is change your clothes, changes the colors of it. And then but you think back to like the earlier days of it, and there was a lot of crazy stuff. There were a lot less laws, or even like back at like when Eleftheria, started forming the guilds. We know that magic people were pretty much persecuted down. There was a lot more dark stuff that eventually led up to like happier, kind of like today. Like when you but like, man, my hardest thing today is I'm gonna have to, I don't know, vacuum or something. I'm gonna have to clean. I didn't clean or do laundry yesterday. I do a lot of things. Whereas like even 100 years ago, it was like, oh no, I've got a splinter. Well, I guess I'm gonna die of an infection. Something like pretty serious back then, but like nothing now. Like getting a cold back then was like a death sentence. Getting like diarrhea back then was a death sentence. Imagine that's a lot of the ways that it was for Magic Fairy Tale. So Hades, Hades just saw a lot of these aspects as pretty much being the hardships of why like the magic people above everything else, pretty much become the rightful rulers of the world. Like I said, he's pretty much Magic Hitler. He didn't see non-magic folk as really neat inside of the world. They are pretty much worthy in a lot of ways in his eyes, but it wasn't a good or evil thing. It was just seeing what he thought was right and what he thought he believed in magic. Which I'm wondering when that's going to get explored because that's actually amongst a couple things that Fairy Tail still hasn't got. This of magic, the depths of magic. That hasn't been fully explored. We just know it's a thing. We know like where magic eventually came from. That being one magic, and it's just one of those like big crazy things that eventually we might get to. Might big explanation thing. Like that could be a really interesting thing. Like if they eventually find it, like that might give some mystery and reason why maybe changed as much as he did. Um, but overall, I think Hades gave such a an interesting distance because up until then there were some pretty good villains, but Hades I think was the first one that really just became like this. I don't I don't know how they're gonna defeat this guy, and they had to defeat him by pulling in a more of like a video game boss fight kind of thing. You had to like pretty much turn off his weakness, like that found his heart, which pretty much let him ignore his age. It gave him the vitality of youth because he's actually old. Like there are old characters in Fairy Tail, but most of them are either that way because of dragons, mortals, special types of. Hades was actually just human, and he was over 100. He was over 120 years old. So like he's still pretty old even by their standards, and it was the art that gave him that. Plus, it let him use aspects of Zeref's magic, a lot of the black arts. Actually, one of the things he was going to do that would like decided the fight was going to be over is he was going to use the repent spell that Zeref used that instantly killed him. A really sad thing for him, kind of ironic what he was going to use to end the Fairy Tail Guild actually, and him, Zeref, the person that he was trying to, you know, as they thought, reawaken, unseal, bring back, and just was another one of these characters who built a lot of their ideals and a lot of their goals around Zeref and what they thought was Zeref's kind of like ideal and what he wanted, but in reality it was other thing fabricated by these guys in order to kind of like have their own belief of what will fuel them and give them pretty much a reason to do like their entire plot. Essentially. Yeah, a lot of them use that as justifiable means, but in reality, obviously, saw none of that is actually what Zeref wanted. None of that is actually what he was intending. He's actually trying to save everybody, where it's like here he's trying to end 90% of the population. Really interesting stuff, personally. There's actually a quote. I think it's one of my favorite quotes by him that kind of like relates to one that Mavis says because when Mavis is actually talks to Kana and gives her fairy glitter, she says like pretty much like mistakes are not shackles that hold you down, but sustenance nurture the heart. And hers was more of like nurturing your emotions. You know, mess up. It could be a life lesson aspect of it. Said like your emotions, more spiritual stuff. Whereas with Hades, he has one that goes along the lines. I believe it's um, mistakes yield experience, but only a true mistake yields nothing. Which is really cool because it's like, yeah, his is more about the experience of what you learn in life and what you can advance off of, whereas Mavis is what's much more over the aspect of what you can gain out of an experience emotionally. Which obviously were two different things because Hades was much more towards the kind of like the idea, the aspect of magic, more of influence of it overall, whereas Mavis was much more stemmed out of where magic itself was stemmed came from emotions. Was there's talk of it coming from like dark, more emotions, and we know that it came from love. So it really just kind of like gives nice connecting points towards these characters. Like I said, like aspects of Hades carrying over potentially to August. Whereas obviously Mavis and Hades knew each other for years, having kind of like ideals that correlated, but eventually divided off into two paths. It just gave a lot. Like there's so many aspects about his character I always really loved, and I'm really hoping that eventually he gets his own spinoff, or we just see like him when he goes on like the journey of him doing his own thing, whether that be young Hades, like well he's still the guildmaster of Fairy Tail for so many years, or like maybe it could be like him going out and trying to find like solutions to Mavis being in her coma, or him going and forming up Grimoire Heart. There's a lot of things it could be. kind of like build a lot more character to him. I think he's one of the ones that would fit the most because like the amount of influence he had on the story in the large aspect. Even though he died in less than half of what the overall story is currently, still like got to keep in mind he was one of the founding members and he led to a lot of aspects in story like Sirius Island. If it wasn't for them showing up and causing such a problem, Acnologia might have never shown up, which then 7 year time skip would have never happened. A lot to what he did that affected the story in such a grand. But anyway, tell me in the comment section below what you think about this guy. And it was much more funny. It was like a person of mystery, but it was much more of like, yeah, I talked about the build up for him, but then I talked about like how awesome of a character he was, what he did. Like I remember like him just dropping Amaterasu when like nothing, and it covered up half of the island, about half of the mass of Sirius Island, and that just being like nothing to him. And then like there's like always that also funny thing of like I always see people like when Lightning Flame Dragon mode, and that being somehow being what turned the fight when absolutely not. All that did was just kind of like get Hades serious and like took it, and after it, he just got up and he took his eye patch off. He's like, huh, I haven't taken this much damage in a couple decades. I gotta give youngster some credit. And it's just like goddamn powerful old wizard Nazi grandpa. Anyway, yeah, love Hades. He's definitely one of my favorite antagonists in this series for sure. He's definitely one of the most deeply expandingly written, say, but good stuff. Now, like I said, comment below. I'd really appreciate if you thumbs up the video, like button, and the subscribe button, and check out my other videos. From that, I appreciate it. Subscribe, and I thank you all for listening. Bye.